Hey guys, welcome back to my channel, and if you're new here, my name is Christina Kent and I'm an oil painter based out of San Francisco. So recently I asked you guys if you had any questions for me about art or life or things like that, and I got a bunch of great questions, so I'm going to be answering them today in this Q&A video. I'm going to split it up into two parts, so one part's going to be focused on learning to paint and building art skills and art materials, and then the other part is going to be focused more on the business side and life stuff. Okay, let's get to the questions. So Christine Phillips from Patreon asks, how did you find your style? Do you do master studies, or what do you think makes for faster skill improvement? So I do a lot of master studies, and I do see them as a key way of finding my style. I think I kind of developed my style in two ways. One, from doing master studies, so looking at artists that really inspired me, that I really was drawn to, and then the other from doing paintings from life, so doing still life paintings, and really just practicing painting what was right in front of me, painting the things that I could see. In particular, when it comes to finding your style, I think master copies are just so useful. On my YouTube channel, I think I have one, you can see a master study that I did of a painting by, it was John Singer Sargent's painting of a group of people. It's like Group with Parasols. And so that's a good example of one of the master copies that I do. Usually I don't try to copy the painting exactly, and especially when you're doing like a Sargent painting or something, of course, you're not going to be able to copy it exactly, but I try to get the gist of the painting in a reasonable amount of time, and just try to like learn from what I'm seeing. Like I try to draw the main lessons from the painting, whether it's the composition of the painting that I really like, or the color usage, or maybe it's the particular brush strokes that the artist was using. But I like to do master copies in this way. And I think especially when it comes to finding your style, master copies are really helpful because it helps you understand not only the art that you like, but also the art that you like to do. Because there's a lot of art that I like I really like some hyper-realistic paintings or some like more illustrative work, like James Jean does these beautiful, fantastical illustrations. And I really like that art, but it's not the kind of art that I like to do because like the process of painting it, the process of drawing it, they use very precise lines and they do things in a certain way that I realize when I try to copy it myself, I don't actually enjoy that as much, versus more kind of impressionistic paintings, more loose paintings. Not only do I find that art really beautiful, but it's also the art that I want to do myself. So I think when you do master copies, you'll start to come to these realizations where maybe you'll try copying someone's style and it just doesn't really feel right. And then you'll try a different style and you feel like, wow, like this really is resonating with me. So I think master copies are great. So one thing that I think about with master copies is don't just copy from one person, but copy from a wide variety of artists. And this is what I talk about in my video about how to learn to paint without going to art school. Master copies are a great way to practice and a great way to learn, but you should copy from a lot of different artists so that you are able to, so that you don't just copy one person's style and learn to paint like one person, but you really start to grow your own personal style. And finding your own style really is an organic process, and you might not even be aware of it while it's happening. I had a lot of people tell me while I was, learning and painting, they would say, oh, we love your style. Oh, we could totally recognize which paintings are yours. And to me, I was thinking, wait, really? Like I have a style? Like I didn't even realize that I had a style until other people were telling me that I had a style. And then I kind of took a step back and I looked at my work and I was like, oh yeah, okay, there are these threads that connect all of my pieces. And TSO93 Art and Nitin D008 also asked similar questions. So they asked, what is the simplest way to learn oil painting? And when and how did you start with oil painting? What are some recommendations for people who want to start but don't know where to begin? So following kind of my answer to the previous question, I totally recommend doing master copies. I think that's a really great way to get started, and it's very simple, just taking someone else's painting and trying to do the best that you can to replicate it. Another thing that I mentioned earlier that is really important when you're starting out, I think, is to do a lot of still life painting. The nice thing about still lifes is that they are really, really simple. You can think of them as like training exercises, or like kind of like drills. Like a musician would be practicing scales, or an athlete is going to do drills of a certain, I don't know, I'm not I don't do sports, so I don't really know what they do. But still lifes allow you to practice a really specific technique, because unlike landscape painting, which can be really complicated and there's all these factors outside of your control, or like portrait painting, where you might spend so much time focusing on trying to get the face right and getting the proportions right, still life painting, I feel like you can control everything about the composition. Like you can get a lemon, you can get some paper, you can set up a very simple composition. You can keep it simple, which is great when you're starting out. And you can really focus on just getting these simple shapes right and these shape relationships. And it teaches you to examine, like to really think about how you're seeing the world and question the colors that you're seeing, the value relationships that you're seeing. Because you know, we kind of go around the world thinking that we're seeing things and we know what we're seeing, but it's not until you try to paint it, and especially trying to paint it from life, so you're really just staring at this object right in front of you, that the more you look, the more you realize you actually don't know what colors a lot of things are. And these value relationships that at a glance maybe you think are obvious become a lot more nuanced the more you look. So I guess, yeah, for beginning painters, I highly recommend doing master copies and also doing painting from life, preferably still life, I think is the easiest way to go. So this also relates to the question by Carol Saffer, who asked, how do you learn and study colors? So I would highly recommend, if you want to learn colors, just practice with still lifes. Get like lemons, get whatever fruits you have or objects lying around your house, and just practice placing them together and trying to paint them. And I have a lot of sheets of colored paper that when I'm doing a still life, I'll put different colors of paper under the objects that I'm painting, and then I just observe how are the colors interacting with each other? What color combinations do I like? What color combinations do I maybe not like? If I shift, say the colored paper that I'm using, how does that shift the feeling of the image? All of these things, you could think of a still life as your own like little experimental setup. And then all of these things you're able to manipulate and control. And then if you just observe really closely, and you try to paint it faithfully, then I think that's the best way to really learn to see color. Going back to the subject of master copies, Nitin D008 asked what artists inspire me, both old and contemporary. Some of my favorite older artists are, I really like kind of like loose, brushy, realistic paintings. So I love John Singer Sargent and Joaquin Sorolla. Those are, I think, some of my favorite older artists. I also really like Edward Hopper. A lot of my work has been compared to Hopper, who I didn't really know that much about until people started like making the comparison. And then I was like, oh, I guess I should check out this guy some more. But I love his work. Just recently started getting interested in the work by Ramon Casas. So yeah, I guess you would call them, I think they're like naturalistic painters for the most part. Those are some of my favorite older painters. But honestly, I get most of my inspiration from contemporary painters. I love Nicolas Uribe. His portraits and figures are just out of this world. And I love the way that he just creates like this visual diary of his daily life that I just think is so beautiful. So Nicolas Uribe is great. I really like Catherine Kehoe. She knows how to simplify the form into these like beautiful, poetic, geometric shapes that I just find is just really masterful work, and just a great example of knowing what's essential and knowing what can be left out. I also really like Mia Bergeron. She does beautiful figure paintings. For landscape painting, I love Claudia Reiling. She does these like really cool, like atmospheric, abstracted landscapes, like taking the landscape and turning it into these beautiful shapes. And I like how her work kind of bridges abstraction and realism. Similar to another painter I really like, Mitchell Johnson, who's a Bay Area painter, which is great. But yeah, both Mitchell Johnson and Claudia Reiling, I feel like they're right on the line between abstraction and realism, and I think that it's really cool to see that in their work. And those are artists whose work has influenced my work a lot. There's other artists that I like, but I don't think their work has influenced me as much because it's kind of a different style. But I love Henrik Uldalen, Sainer Edam, and James Jean, as I mentioned earlier. They're great. There's just so many amazing contemporary artists out there. Like every time I go on Instagram, I just feel like, wow, like it's insane how many amazing artists there are. And like you think you've seen everything, and then you'll find a new artist who's just doing something else amazing. Like I think like that's one of my favorite things about being alive today, is that we just have like the whole art world at our fingertips, and it's really magical. Okay, Daniel Rockburn asks, do you have a strict routine or process that you like to follow? And I think he's referring to the painting process itself, and maybe not so much like my art practice. So for my painting process, it's not exactly strict. For the most part, I do follow a specific process, but I allow for like flexibility depending on how I'm feeling. So in general, what I do is I first tone the canvas with a neutral color, usually like either burnt sienna or burnt umber, with a brown, some sort of brown. And then I do a light underpainting on top of that. So this is like my drawing. I do this kind of light underpainting of usually, yeah, either with burnt sienna or burnt umber or raw umber. I'll do this underpainting that just kind of shows the lights and darks of the image and maps out the general composition of the image. Then once I do that, I'll let it dry. Usually it takes like a day or so to dry. And then I'll go in with color. And then I do a block in where I just try to get the general shapes and colors, where like kind of if you squint, everything looks right. And then once I do the block in, then I'll go in and I'll refine areas of detail. And I usually start refining detail in kind of my focal area. So usually my paintings have one area where there's like the most interesting things going on, and then I have the rest of the area is kind of a support and kind of helps just lead your eye around the image. So I start refining the detail in the main focal area, and then I kind of, as I'm building up detail in one area, then I'll start to build up detail in the other areas that support it. So that's my general process. But sometimes I'll spend more time on the underpainting, make it really detailed. Other times the underpainting is just very quick, and sometimes I'll just go straight to painting with color without doing an underpainting at all. It kind of just depends on how I'm feeling that day. But yeah, overall, that's my process that I usually follow for most paintings. Ciara Chick asked, she says, I struggle a lot with landscapes and viewing them more as shapes than as each individual thing. And then when I do start, I can't seem to get past the ugly phase and focus more on the colors and the things in the shapes. Is there something you do to help you stay unfocused in a sense, or a general way to view landscapes? Yeah, so with landscapes, I think it's really tricky, and that's like one of the main things that I'm most fascinated about with painting is how do I take something really complex, like as complex and full and high definition as reality is, and turn that into a simple painting. And I think that's like a lot of like the poetry of painting, right? Is like you distill the essence of reality into this image without articulating every last detail in the image. So when it comes to landscapes, I think there are a few things that help. One is to focus on a small portion of the landscape. I think one thing that I tend to do when I first see a landscape is I get really excited and I want to paint everything. And I realize actually like my best paintings tend to be when I just restrict myself to focusing on one part of the landscape. So I would like try to simplify the image by focusing on just one part of the landscape and painting that. Then once you've kind of narrowed down where, like what you're going to paint, there are a few things that can help. I think one thing that helps a lot is squinting. So just squint your eyes and try to see like what are the big shapes that that you're seeing. Another thing that really helps with simplifying the landscape is practicing doing value studies. So push yourself to look at a landscape and then convert it into just black and white, and see if you can only use black and white, how are you going to convey that landscape, and do some studies that way. And then once you do some black and white studies, or like 2 value studies, you can go to 3 value studies where you have a black, a white, and a gray. And if you can only use that then how would you convey the landscape? And I think these exercises really help you make decisions and say, okay, this, like, I'm going to simplify things in this way. And then I'd say once you've made those decisions, once you said, you know what, this is the overall, like, I think about it in terms of what's the overall design of the painting? How are things composed in terms of darks and lights? And then I try to make a really strong choice there, and then I stick to that. So then once I decide, okay, this area is dark, this area is light, then once I start going in and adding details, as I'm adding those details, I try to add them so that it doesn't break up that overall light-dark composition. So I still have the overall design that I planned in the beginning, and then I'm more just think of it as like adding nuance to the light and dark areas, but not creating anything that would distract from the overall vision. So that's like what I guess those would be like my main tips for simplifying the landscape and for making strong compositions for landscape painting. So Christine Phillips from Patreon asks, I know your first medium is oil and you paint with acrylic gouache. Do you paint with regular gouache? So I don't. I started painting with acrylic gouache because I had tried plein air painting in oils and I had no idea what I was doing, and I kind of brought like my studio easel out and it was like a huge mess. And I complained to one of my friends and they recommended acrylic gouache because it can layer like oils. It doesn't reactivate with water like regular gouache does, so it can layer like oils, and but it also dries really fast and is super easy for sketching. So I got some of that and I really liked it, and I've liked it so much that I haven't really felt the need to look for another medium. I'm kind of curious about regular gouache, but and maybe like if I had more time I would explore that. But right now, I'm really happy with how acrylic gouache handles. I'm really enjoying it, and I still feel like I have a lot to learn with this medium. So yeah, so maybe in the future I'll try regular gouache at some point, but I think I have enough art supplies right now to keep me busy. So Blake Art Materials asked, how did you initially select the materials and brands to use in your work? Is it artist instructor referrals, your own research? What's affordable and available locally? Yeah, so most of my supplies that I selected, they came from instructor referrals. So I am mostly self-taught artist, but I have done some workshops with other painters. And in the workshops, usually they have a recommended supply list, which usually suggests some brands of things that they like to use. So like the brushes that I use, they're Princeton Summit Series flats for the most part. And those were recommended by Sarah Sedgwick, who's an amazing instructor. A lot of the different color paints were picked up in other workshops because I started out with a pretty limited palette. And then over time I would do workshops that would ask us to add a few colors to the palette. So then I'd get those colors too. And then through those workshops, I kind of figured out which colors I really liked. Most of the brands, so I found what's most available. I usually try to stick to professional grade oil paints. And then from there, I kind of go with what's available. So I found like Winsor & Newton is pretty easily available. Also Gamblin, I can usually find. Haven't tried as much some of the other oil paint brands, although I'd be interested in that. And then the one thing that I did think was really cool about Winsor & Newton is that they actually have cadmium free colors. So they have like cadmium red and cadmium yellow that mimic the look of the actual cadmium colors, but they actually use less toxic materials, which I think is great because it's like a small thing that we can do for the environment. And also for our own health as painters. So that is one thing that I've kind of discovered on my own that I think is pretty cool. And kind of along those lines, MCVA asked, do you worry about fugitive pigments when choosing colors for new painting? And if you're not familiar with the term fugitive pigments, it's the phenomenon that some pigments are going to change color over time. So sometimes you'll look at old paintings and they'll look really dull, or they'll look, they just look kind of off. And that's because a lot of the pigments that they used in the past were not kind of like stable colors that would look the same over time. Over the years, the colors either became less saturated, maybe they became lighter, they became darker, and so the look of the painting changes over many years. So I am concerned about that. I do want my paintings to have longevity, and for the most part, I've been leaning on the recommendations of instructors to ensure that I'm getting really high quality paints and I'm using high quality pigments. But at the same time, I know some of the pigments that I am using and that have been recommended by instructors for many, many years are not stable. Like I think alizarin crimson, there's a lot of issues with that pigment. And it's not a pigment that I use too much, but I have noticed I have been using it a little bit more and more lately. And this is a pigment that like tons and tons of painters use. I think it's like a staple pigment on most oil painters' palettes. But there's this concern that it might change, you know, in 100 years, 200 years, something like that. So I do think like now that I'm realizing that I like some of these pigments and I want to keep using them, I think the next step for me is to try to figure out more stable replacements. Like I think there are replacements like permanent alizarin, which is like a replacement for alizarin crimson. I've heard mixed reviews of some of the replacements, but I think it's worth trying out because I would like my paintings to last for hundreds of years. So Erica Halperin asked, can you talk about your setup, mediums, favorite tools, brushes, and how you handle cleanup? Yeah, so since I'm painting from my home studio, I don't have good ventilation and I'm really sensitive to the smells of different mediums. So usually while I'm painting, I'm just using the paint. I don't use any medium. And so I paint with like really thick paint. And initially I didn't think that you were able to do that. I thought you kind of had to paint with a medium. But more and more I'm hearing about other artists who do that, especially like for one, Nicolas Uribe. I think most of his paintings, he's not using any medium. And he's amazing. So I'm like, okay, well, if he can do it, like it's possible to make beautiful paintings without medium. So I can do it too. So I, for the most part, don't use medium, but there are some exceptions. So at the beginning of my painting process, when I'm toning the panels, I'll go outside and tone them with some Gamsol mixed with either burnt sienna or raw umber. And then when I'm doing the underpainting, I'll do the underpainting using Galkid gel, which is like a quick drying medium from Gamblin, and it's a gel, so like there aren't any annoying vapors. And the nice part is like I can do my underpainting and then it's usually dry by the next day, and then I can paint directly on it to add the color. So those are the main exceptions. Oh, also for brush cleaning, I clean my brushes outside and I use Gamsol to clean the brushes. I know there are like that you can use like different soaps and stuff to use the brushes. I will admit my brushes don't last very long. I think I could definitely improve my brush cleaning to take better care of them, but for the most part I just use Gamsol. For brushes, I usually use synthetic flats. The ones behind me here are mostly Princeton Summit series. And I just really like flats. I think you can get a nice variety of strokes, from like really sharp lines to nice broader brush strokes. And for the most part, that's what I use in my paintings. Although I do think like I would like to explore using other types of brushes and seeing the marks that they make. I think that that's one area where I could push myself a little bit more. But if I had to choose just one brush, it would definitely be a flat. In addition to the flats, I also like to use palette knives to create some interesting textures. I kind of go back and forth between doing paintings with just brushes versus doing paintings with brush and palette knife. It kind of just depends on how I'm feeling, but I do really like some of the cool abstract shapes that you can get when you're using the palette knife as opposed to the brush. Thanks so much for your questions. So that covers the art process and materials questions. And it took a bit longer than I expected to answer all the questions, so I'll be answering the business-related questions in the next video. As always, a huge shout out to my supporters on Patreon. You guys are amazing. Thank you so much for supporting my art. If you're not already a supporter on my Patreon, check it out at the link in my description. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you next time.